One American sniper killed 48 German soldiers in under 2 hours using a condom. This happened in October 1944, near Mortain, France, in dense fog where accurate rifle fire was supposed to be impossible beyond a few dozen meters. German infantry believed weather was protection. Fog meant cover. Rain meant survival. That belief was wrong. That morning, German squads advanced into open ground and were erased one by one. No muzzle flash, no identifiable firing position, no chance to return fire. Veteran soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front froze in place, unable to understand how Americans were shooting accurately when German optics were useless. This was not superior marksmanship, it was not experimental technology, and it was not luck. It was a crude, unofficial field modification, something no doctrine mentioned, no engineer designed, and no officer approved. Yet once it appeared, weather stopped being a limitation. Visibility stopped being protection, and the side that adapted faster gained an advantage the enemy could not counter in time. If you listen to this entire story, you'll understand how one absurd improvisation exposed a fatal weakness inside the German war machine, and why, after moments like this, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Mortain was not supposed to matter. By October 1944, the German front in Normandy was already cracked. Operation Ludic, Hitler's last counterattack in the West, had failed weeks earlier. American armor was pushing east. Air superiority was absolute. German units were under strength, undersupplied, and exhausted. So when orders came down for a routine probe near the hedgerows south of Mortain, no one expected disaster. This was not a major offensive. No tanks, no artillery preparation. Just infantry moving to test American lines before the weather cleared. The weather, in theory, favored them. Fog rolled in thick from the Channel overnight, settling low into the Norman countryside. Visibility dropped fast. In places, men couldn't see past 50 meters. Rifles were useless at range. Optics fogged. Binoculars smeared into gray glass. For German infantry doctrine, this was protection. Fog meant reduced American air power. Fog meant snipers couldn't operate. Fog meant movement without being seen. At least, that's what the manual said. Shortly after first light, small German elements began moving out of covered positions, hedgerows, sunken lanes, ruined farm walls, and into open ground they believed was masked by weather. They advanced by the book, squads spaced correctly. Men low, movement by bounds. And then the first man dropped. No crack of incoming fire. No visible muzzle flash. Just a body collapsing forward, face first, into wet grass. The squad froze. Seconds passed. No follow-up shots. No tracer. No sound to locate. They waited, expecting the mistake to reveal the shooter. Nothing, so they moved again. Another man fell. This time a headshot. Now they understood something was wrong. Not that there was a sniper, German units were used to that. But that someone was firing accurately in conditions where accurate fire shouldn't exist. That realization changed everything. Men stopped trusting the fog, stopped trusting distance, stopped trusting the terrain. Movement slowed to a crawl. Squads hugged cover that no longer felt protective. Officers hesitated, and hesitation in open ground is fatal. From the German side, the battlefield began to feel distorted. Distances made no sense. Angles felt wrong. Shots came not from where danger should be, but from where doctrine said danger could not be. This wasn't chaos. It was order imposed by someone they couldn't see. What the Germans didn't know was that this section of ground wasn't random. It had been selected. Overlooking the approach route was a stone farmhouse, abandoned, partially damaged, but structurally intact. Its second floor offered elevation. Its windows framed the hedgerows like firing lanes. From there, anyone with patience could dominate the ground below. American infantry doctrine emphasized aggressive movement, but American sniper doctrine emphasized something else entirely: terrain ownership. Not through force, through vision. While German patrols focused on where the Americans should be, one American position focused on where the Germans had to go. Distances had been measured. Fields of fire mapped. Approach routes memorized. This wasn't improvisation under fire. It was preparation waiting for opportunity. As German elements continued to push forward, Command cohesion began to fray. Radio operators tried to signal back and went silent. Squad leaders attempted to regroup and didn't get back up. Each loss forced another pause. Each pause exposed more men. German responses followed doctrine perfectly. They tried to identify the firing direction. They attempted bounding movement. They prepared a limited flanking maneuver. None of it worked, because every solution assumed a shared limitation that visibility restricted both sides equally. That assumption was killing them. From the American position, the engagement didn't look dramatic. No panic, no rush, just targets appearing, hesitating, moving again, and disappearing. What made this especially lethal was not volume of fire, but selection. Men giving hand signals, men carrying radios, men pointing. Every time leadership tried to reassert control, it marked itself, and every mark was answered. German veterans later described the sensation as being hunted by something patient, not aggressive, not hurried, but inevitable. The fog that should have hidden them instead isolated them, turning each movement into a gamble. By the time German officers recognized that this was not a normal sniper engagement, they faced a dilemma. To pull back meant crossing open ground under unseen fire. To push forward meant exposing more men to a shooter they couldn't locate. To wait meant bleeding slowly, one man at a time. The battlefield had become asymmetric, not in numbers, not in weapons, but in perception. One side could see, the other could not. And the longer the engagement continued, the worse that imbalance became. Because whatever advantage the Americans possessed was not diminishing. It was compounding. Each minute taught the shooter more. Each minute taught the Germans nothing. This was the moment not when the first man fell, but when German doctrine failed to produce answers, that the engagement stopped being a skirmish and became something else entirely. Something instructional, something systemic. And the reason for that imbalance, the reason one side could fight normally while the other was effectively blind, had nothing to do with superior weapons, better training, or secret technology. It came from a decision so small, so unofficial, that no report mentioned it at first, but it was already too late. The ground near Mortain had become lethal, not because of what was added to the battlefield, but because of one limitation that had quietly been removed. On paper, this engagement made no sense. German infantry doctrine in 1944 was not primitive. Their units were battle-hardened, led by experienced NCOs, and trained to operate independently under pressure. German optics, binoculars, and sniper scopes were among the best in the world. Zeiss glass routinely outperformed Allied equipment in clarity and construction. American snipers, by contrast, were newer to the battlefield. The U.S. Army had entered the war without a dedicated sniper culture. Training programs were rushed. Doctrine was borrowed, adapted, and still evolving. Equipment was adequate, not exceptional. The standard American sniper rifle did not intimidate German marksmen. Yet here, in the fog near Mortain, those assumptions collapsed. The Germans were the ones blind. The Americans were the ones striking. This inversion violated every expectation both sides carried into combat. German units attempted to apply solutions that had worked for years. They halted movement to listen for sound cues. They waited for muzzle flashes. They tried to bait fire with exposed helmets and equipment. Nothing revealed the shooter. Fog absorbed sound. Moisture flattened light, and every attempt to provoke a reaction only created another target. What German commanders could not accept, and therefore could not counter, was that the limitation they believed applied universally did not apply equally. Visibility was asymmetric. From the American position, targets were not vague shapes. They were identifiable figures. Men crouching, men signaling, men hesitating. The battlefield retained structure, even as the Germans experienced it as chaos. This is the moment where most engagements break down, when one side loses situational awareness faster than it loses manpower. German doctrine relied on restoring that awareness quickly. Squad leaders were trained to re-establish control through movement and communication. Radios came up. Hand signals increased. Runners were dispatched. And one by one, those efforts failed. Each corrective action made the problem worse, A man stepping forward to give direction exposed himself longer than a man moving silently. A radio operator trying to transmit lingered in one place. An officer attempting to rally his men became visible through posture and behavior. The shooter didn't need to fire often, he needed to fire correctly. This created a psychological collapse that spread faster than casualties. German infantry began to move less, not more. They hugged ground that no longer protected them. They waited for conditions to improve, but the conditions weren't changing. Time, which should have favored the attackers, favored the defender. From the American side, the engagement followed a very different logic. Sniper doctrine emphasized patience over tempo. The goal was not suppression, but paralysis. Remove the people who made decisions, and the unit would defeat itself. That doctrine only worked if the shooter could see long enough to choose. And that was the puzzle. German optics should have been performing better. American optics should have been failing. Instead, German binoculars fogged, rifle scopes smeared, moisture condensed inside housings, turning precision instruments into liabilities. Men wiped lenses with gloves and sleeves, only to worsen the blur. The Americans did not share that problem. Not today. As minutes turned into an hour, German commanders faced reports that didn't fit doctrine. Casualties mounted without clear cause. Fire superiority could not be established. Suppression fire wasted ammunition without effect. The engagement stopped resembling combat and started resembling exposure. This forced a decision: pull back or push through. Pulling back meant crossing ground already proven deadly. Pushing through meant committing more men into an environment they could not read. Either option assumed the fog would eventually level the field. It didn't. Instead, the imbalance deepened. From the American position, the shooter learned patterns. He recognized how German squads reacted after a casualty. He anticipated where men would move next, not because of guesswork, but because doctrine made those moves predictable. The Germans, meanwhile, learned nothing. They could not see improvement. They could not test hypotheses. Every attempt to figure it out ended with another body down. This is when experienced soldiers begin to doubt their tools. And when soldiers doubt their tools, discipline erodes. German after-action reports would later describe this engagement with careful language: enemy sniper of unusual effectiveness, optical superiority under adverse conditions. We have sewed for more mad, but in the moment, the language was simpler. Men whispered that the Americans could see through fog, that their rifles were different, that something had changed. None of those explanations were correct. What had changed was not the rifle, not the training, not the terrain. What had changed was a single constraint, one so small that it never appeared in doctrine manuals, and so unofficial that it spread without orders. And that constraint removal created an advantage the Germans had no framework to counter. The longer the engagement continued, the clearer one fact became. This was not an isolated firefight. It was a demonstration of what happened when one army solved problems at ground level and the other waited for solutions from above. By the time German units began to withdraw, the damage was already done. Not just in casualties, but in certainty. The fog had stopped being neutral, weather had stopped being predictable, and assumptions that had guided years of training no longer held. The reason for that shift had nothing to do with engineering breakthroughs or classified technology. It came from a decision made quietly, informally, and without permission. And once that decision entered the battlefield, it didn't stay isolated for long. It spread. And what began here, near Mortain, would not end here. The advantage didn't come from skill. It didn't come from experience. And it didn't come from better weapons. It came from removing a single limitation, one so basic that no doctrine ever questioned it. Every rifle scope, no matter how precise, suffers from the same enemy: moisture. Fog doesn't just reduce visibility. It condenses. It settles. It clings to glass. In Normandy's climate, optics failed not because they were poorly built, but because they were exposed. German optics were excellent, often superior, but excellence assumed proper conditions, and that assumption was fatal. German scopes relied on rigid protection: metal caps, removable covers, precision housings. To shoot, those covers had to come off. To see clearly, lenses had to be wiped. Each action required movement. Each movement took time. Each second mattered. Under clear skies, this was manageable. Under fog, it became a liability. Every attempt to restore clarity reset the clock. Every reset exposed the shooter. On the American side, no one redesigned the scope. No engineer improved the glass. No factory issued new equipment. Instead, someone asked a simpler question. What if the glass never got wet in the first place? The solution didn't come from manuals or testing facilities. It came from idle conversation, the kind soldiers have while waiting for the next push. A joke, an experiment, a risk that cost nothing. A standard issue military condom, thin, latex, flexible, waterproof, stretched tight over the objective lens of a rifle scope. No moving parts, no removal, no delay, just a barrier. Latex doesn't fog the way glass does. Moisture beads and runs off. Visibility degrades slightly but remains consistent. And consistency is everything. The shooter no longer needed perfect clarity. He needed reliable clarity. This is where the advantage became irreversible. German soldiers experienced a battlefield that changed minute to minute. One moment visibility existed, the next it didn't. Their perception fluctuated. Their confidence collapsed. The American shooter experienced a battlefield that stayed readable. Not perfect, not ideal, but stable. That stability allowed something far more dangerous than accuracy. It allowed anticipation. When German squads paused, the shooter didn't wonder why. He knew doctrine demanded reassessment. When radio operators knelt, he didn't guess. He knew communication would follow casualties. When officers stepped forward, he didn't hesitate. He knew leadership would try to restore momentum. Each decision the Germans made followed patterns drilled into them for years. And each pattern was visible because the shooter could see when others could not. The trick didn't increase lethality per shot. It increased control over time. That distinction matters. A sniper firing blind might score a lucky hit. A sniper firing consistently controls the engagement. As the hours passed, this control became systemic. Targets were not chosen randomly. They were selected based on effect. Men carrying radios, men giving orders, men pointing. The removal of moisture from glass created a cascading collapse in command. German units weren't being wiped out by volume of fire. They were being dismantled. Every shot forced a reaction. Every reaction exposed the next vulnerability. The fog, once trusted, became an accomplice to the shooter. Sound traveled poorly. Movement stood out sharply. Stillness became survival, and stillness surrendered initiative. The Germans couldn't adapt fast enough because the problem didn't register as a problem. Their optics hadn't failed, he said. They were performing as designed. The battlefield had simply changed, and their design philosophy hadn't. This is the core contradiction. German military culture prized precision engineering and formal solutions. Problems were addressed through design improvements, testing cycles, and approvals. American military culture tolerated imperfection as long as results improved. The condom trick did not pass through approval channels. It did not wait for validation. It spread because it worked. One soldier shared it with another. Another tested it. Another adopted it. No paperwork. No authorization. By the time higher command noticed, it was already standard practice in some units. German forces, when they eventually identified the method, reacted predictably. They tested it. They evaluated alternatives. They recommended purpose-built solutions. Those solutions never arrived. Industry couldn't keep up. Logistics couldn't prioritize. The war moved faster than bureaucracy. Meanwhile, American snipers continued operating in conditions their enemies believed neutralized combat. Rain, fog, low visibility. None of it stopped them. The trick's power wasn't that it was clever. It was that it removed waiting. Waiting for better equipment. Waiting for orders. Waiting for conditions to improve. The American approach replaced waiting with action. That difference, trivial in isolation, compounded across hundreds of engagements. By the time German units recognized the pattern, morale had already shifted. Soldiers no longer trusted weather. They no longer trusted cover. They no longer trusted doctrine. Every foggy morning carried the same fear. They can see us. That belief changed behavior. Men avoided exposed positions even when tactics demanded them. Leadership hesitated. Initiative died. None of this appeared clearly in casualty reports. But it was decisive, because wars are not won only by killing more men. They are won by forcing the enemy to fight worse. And that is what this small modification achieved. It didn't make Americans superhuman. It didn't make Germans incompetent. It made one side adaptable and the other rigid. Near Mortain, this difference was measured in bodies, but across the war, it would be measured in outcomes. The battlefield lesson was simple. When constraints are removed quietly, the enemy often doesn't realize the rules have changed until it's too late. And here, the rule that died was the belief that weather equalized combat. It didn't, not anymore. Once control is established, destruction becomes procedural. This was no longer a duel. It was a process. From the American position, the engagement unfolded with brutal clarity. Targets appeared, reacted, adjusted, and exposed themselves in predictable ways. The fog no longer concealed movement. It amplified it. Any change in posture stood out. Any pause drew attention. The shooter did not rush. Rushing creates mistakes. Mistakes reveal positions. Instead, he allowed the Germans to defeat themselves. The first phase was quiet. Small patrols moved forward to test the ground. When they were eliminated without response, German commanders assumed a limited sniper presence, a nuisance, a delay, something to be suppressed once identified. That assumption lasted minutes. As casualties mounted, German leaders attempted to reassert control. Runners were sent, radios came up. Orders were given to push through quickly and break contact. Each decision accelerated the collapse. Radio operators knelt longer than riflemen. Runners moved faster than caution allowed. Officers stood when others crouched. The shooter did not need to search for targets. They presented themselves. By the time the Germans realized they were not facing a single lucky marksman but a position they could not read, the engagement had already shifted into a different category. This was not harassment. It was attrition without contact. Every attempt to restore initiative created more losses. Suppression fire wasted ammunition into fog. Smoke grenades failed to obscure because moisture flattened plumes and revealed movement above them. Bounding maneuvers collapsed because the first bound never reached safety. The Germans were fighting blind, and blind fighting favors the patient. From the farmhouse, the engagement was tracked minute by minute. Distances had been pre-ranged, landmarks memorized, corrections made quietly. Each shot served a purpose beyond the immediate kill. Officers fell, and platoons stalled. Radio operators fell, and coordination died. Machine gunners fell, and movement froze. What followed was not panic. Panic burns hot and fast. This was something worse. It was paralysis. German soldiers stopped trusting their instincts. Men waited for orders that never came. Leaders hesitated, unsure whether standing up would draw fire. Initiative drained away as survival instincts overrode training. The fog intensified this effect. Visibility was inconsistent. One moment a shape appeared, the next it vanished. Men fired at ghosts and received nothing in return. Sound offered no guidance. Direction could not be traced. The shooter's position remained undiscovered not because it was perfectly hidden, but because the Germans lacked the sensory feedback needed to solve the problem. Combat is a feedback loop. Here, the loop was broken. German after-action reports would later describe the engagement clinically. Enemy sniper of unusual effectiveness. Inability to locate firing position. High casualties during movement. He speaks. Ardered. Those words conceal the reality. This was a unit being dismantled in real time. As the body count rose, command decisions narrowed. Withdrawal was discussed. So was waiting for artillery support. But artillery required observation, and observation required visibility. Air support was impossible. The fog that was supposed to protect them now denied them every external solution. The Germans were trapped in a self-contained problem, and inside that problem, one side could see. The withdrawal order, when it finally came, sealed the outcome. Pulling back required crossing the same ground that had already proven lethal. Men rose from cover and moved carefully. Slowly, but movement itself was enough. The shooter waited for patterns. Retreating soldiers moved in clusters. Leaders attempted to organize files. Men exposed themselves longer than attackers ever do. The casualties did not spike. They accumulated. This is what made the engagement devastating. There was no single catastrophic moment to react to. No explosion, no breakthrough. Just steady, unrelenting loss. By the time the last German elements cleared the area, the numbers told a stark story. 48 confirmed kills. 2 hours, 1 position, but numbers alone missed the point. Those 48 men were not random. They represented leadership, communication, and momentum stripped away piece by piece. The psychological impact far exceeded the physical losses. German survivors reported the same sensation during interrogation: helplessness. They described being hunted by an enemy they could not engage. They described fog as an enemy rather than protection. They described a battlefield that no longer made sense. That loss of meaning is fatal in combat. Soldiers can endure danger. They can endure casualties. They cannot endure incomprehension. What made this engagement especially damaging was its timing. By October 1944, German units in the West were already stretched thin. Replacements were younger, less trained, equipment shortages were constant, morale was fragile. This encounter did not break the army. It confirmed their fears. If Americans could operate effectively in fog, then no condition offered relief. There was no safe window, no weather to wait out, no environmental equalizer left. The engagement near Mortain became a reference point. Not because of its scale, many battles were larger, but because of its implications. It demonstrated that American forces had crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer constrained by the same limitations. This realization spread faster than official reports. Word moved through units, through whispered warnings, through changes in behavior. Men avoided open ground even when orders demanded speed. Leaders hesitated to expose themselves. Movement slowed across the front during poor visibility. None of this appeared on maps, but it altered the tempo of operations. For the Americans, the lesson was simpler. The trick worked. It required no new equipment, no authorization, no logistics. It could be adopted immediately, and because it was simple, it spread. What began as a local improvisation became common practice. Snipers shared it quietly. Spotters adopted it. Units included it without paperwork. By the time higher command noticed, the battlefield had already changed. German investigators would eventually identify the method. Tests confirmed its effectiveness. Reports were written, recommendations made. Nothing followed. There was no time, no capacity, no system to translate insight into action quickly enough. This asymmetry, not in intelligence, but in speed, defined the outcome. One side learned and applied. The other learned and delayed. Near Mortain, that difference was measured in bodies. Across the front, it would be measured in momentum. The destruction was not spectacular. It was efficient. And efficiency, when repeated, becomes dominance. The ground that morning was not seized by force. It was rendered unusable. German soldiers did not lose because they were outnumbered. They lost because they were outadapted. And that distinction mattered far beyond a single farmhouse or a single foggy field. Because what happened here was not an anomaly. It was a preview. The condom was not the weapon. It never was. What mattered was what the condom represented and what it revealed. Near Mortain, the battlefield exposed a truth German planners had spent years denying. Wars are not decided by perfect designs. They are decided by how fast an army adapts when reality breaks the design. German military culture was built on engineering excellence. American military culture was built on acceptable solutions, deployed immediately. That difference was invisible on paper. In combat, it was decisive. The German army did not lack intelligence. They did not lack skilled engineers. They did not lack awareness of the problem. They lacked speed. When German snipers encountered fogged optics, they documented it. Reports went up the chain. Testing was conducted. Improvements were proposed. purpose-built equipment was recommended. This process made sense in peacetime. In war, it was lethal. American soldiers did not document the problem. They solved it, not elegantly, not officially, but effectively. And once the solution worked, it spread without waiting for permission. This is the real asymmetry that emerged in late 1944. One army required authorization to change. The other required proof. Proof arrived in the form of bodies on the ground. The engagement near Mortain was not unique because of its kill count. It was unique because it demonstrated how small adaptations could multiply effectiveness across an entire force. The trick did not require training programs. It did not require factories. It did not require logistics chains. It required only three things: a problem recognized at ground level, a solution available immediately, a culture that allowed soldiers to act on it. Once those conditions existed, the advantage scaled. American snipers across the front began operating in weather conditions their enemies avoided. Fog no longer paused operations. Rain no longer slowed engagement tempo. Poor visibility stopped being a shared limitation. This had consequences far beyond individual firefights. German units began adjusting behavior. Movement slowed during bad weather. Leadership exposure decreased. Initiative suffered. Units waited for conditions to improve, and in waiting, surrendered time. Time favored the Americans. By late 1944, time had become the most valuable resource on the Western Front. American logistics flowed uninterrupted. Replacements arrived continuously. Ammunition was abundant. Germany had none of these advantages. Every delay compounded disadvantage. Every hesitation allowed pressure to build elsewhere. This is why seemingly trivial innovations mattered, not because they were clever, but because they removed friction. Friction slows armies more effectively than enemy fire. German forces carried enormous friction by 1944. Bureaucratic approval processes, equipment shortages, doctrinal rigidity, an officer corps trained to execute orders, not reinterpret them. American forces, by contrast, embraced a messy flexibility. Sherman tanks were not superior on paper. M1 Garand rifles were not elegant. American artillery was not refined, but all of it worked reliably, repeatedly, and at scale. The condom trick fit perfectly inside this ecosystem. It was cheap, it was disposable, it was good enough, and good enough. Applied everywhere. Beat, perfect. Applied slowly. This pattern repeated across the war. American tank crews developed field-expedient armor reinforcement. Infantry modified equipment without authorization. Pilots adjusted tactics faster than manuals could be rewritten. None of these innovations were decisive alone. Together, they were unstoppable. German forces often recognized American advantages too late, not because they were blind, but because their system could not react quickly enough. This is why the outcome of the war shifted irreversibly by late 1944. Not because Germany ran out of weapons, but because Germany ran out of adaptability. The sniper at Mortain did not change the war by killing 48 men. He changed it by proving that weather, doctrine, and engineering superiority could all be bypassed by practical improvisation. That proof mattered. Once soldiers believe the enemy can operate under conditions they cannot, morale collapses quietly. Decisions slow. Initiative dies. Fear fills the gaps doctrine once occupied. German afterwar interviews reflect this shift. Soldiers spoke of American snipers with a different tone, not respect, but unease. They described enemies who could strike when it should not be possible. Was to Schoden. That perception altered behavior long after Mortain. American sniper activity remained consistent regardless of weather. German sniper activity declined sharply during poor visibility. This asymmetry reshaped the battlefield. Every foggy morning favored the Americans. Every rainy night increased pressure. The battlefield never announced this change. It simply reflected it. By the time German investigators fully understood the trick, it no longer mattered. The war had moved on. Fronts had shifted. Resources were gone. The solution arrived too late, trapped inside a system that demanded perfection before action. The Americans had already acted. This is why the real weapon at Mortain was not latex stretched over glass. It was a military culture that allowed a private joke to become a battlefield standard. It was an army that trusted soldiers to solve problems instead of waiting for permission. It was speed, not brilliance, that tipped the balance. And speed, once gained, is almost impossible to counter. Near Mortain, the fog lifted eventually. But by then, the lesson was permanent. Weather would never protect German forces again. Doctrine would never fully catch up. And small, unofficial decisions would continue shaping outcomes far larger than their creators ever imagined. This is how wars are actually decided. Not by wonder weapons, not by grand strategies, but by countless small advantages applied faster than the enemy can respond. And sometimes, all it takes to expose that difference is a 3-cent solution stretched over a piece of glass. The shooting near Mortain eventually stopped, not because the Germans solved the problem, not because the fog lifted, but because there was no one left to advance. When German units finally withdrew from the area, the ground told a quiet story. No shell craters, no destroyed buildings, no signs of a major battle, just bodies spaced across fields and hedgerows, each one marking a decision that had failed. Later, German reports tried to explain what happened. They described an enemy sniper with unusual effectiveness. They noted accurate fire under poor visibility. They recommended investigation into American optical equipment. They never fully captured the truth, because the truth was uncomfortable. The Americans had not out-engineered them. They had out-adapted them. Investigations were conducted. Tests confirmed that a thin latex barrier could prevent moisture from blinding optics. German engineers proposed purpose-built solutions, better seals, improved housings, standardized covers. None of it reached the front. By late 1944, Germany no longer lacked ideas. It lacked time. Factories were bombed. Supply chains were broken. Replacement troops were rushed. Every solution competed for resources that no longer existed. Even when the problem was understood, the system could not respond fast enough. The Americans didn't wait for a system. They didn't formalize the trick. They didn't publish it in manuals. They didn't seek approval. It spread the way effective battlefield knowledge always spreads quietly, informally, through results. Snipers shared it with spotters. Spotters shared it with other teams. Units adopted it because it worked. By the time higher command noticed, the battlefield had already absorbed the change. And that is the part history often misses. Wars are not decided only by famous weapons or named operations. They are decided by which army learns faster at ground level. At Mortain, the lesson was simple and brutal. Weather is only protection if both sides are limited by it. The moment one side removes that limit, the environment becomes a weapon. After October 1944, German soldiers no longer trusted fog. They no longer trusted rain. They no longer trusted the idea that conditions could ever make them safe. That belief mattered. Men hesitated to move when doctrine demanded speed. Leaders avoided exposure when leadership required visibility. Initiative, already fragile, eroded further. None of this showed up clearly in casualty statistics, but it shaped the battlefield every day afterward. American sniper activity continued regardless of conditions. German sniper activity dropped sharply in poor visibility. That imbalance did not win the war by itself, but it fed into something larger. The same pattern appeared everywhere. American tank crews modified equipment in the field. Infantry adapted tactics without waiting for orders. Pilots adjusted formations faster than manuals could be rewritten. None of these changes were perfect. All of them were immediate. Germany, by contrast, remained committed to solving problems correctly, even when solving them quickly mattered more. This difference did not make headlines. It did not appear on maps. But by late 1944, it had become decisive. The sniper at Mortain did not know he was demonstrating a strategic truth. He was solving a practical problem in front of him. But that solution revealed something far larger. It showed that the German war machine, for all its engineering brilliance, had become rigid, and that the American war effort, for all its imperfections, had become adaptive. Once that gap opened, it could not be closed in time. The war did not end because of a condom stretched over a rifle scope. It ended because one side learned how to turn small advantages into permanent ones faster than the other side could respond. Near Mortain, 48 men died in 2 hours. But the real damage was done elsewhere. It was done to certainty, to doctrine, to the belief that the old rules still applied. And once those rules collapsed, the outcome was no longer in doubt. That is how the war was really decided, quietly, incrementally, by people close enough to the problem to solve it and free enough to act. Sometimes history turns not on grand decisions, but on the smallest rule someone dares to break.